Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another Home Education Matters, and today I am joined by Jo Moorcroft, our dog behaviourist expert, but also having a conversation with me about how dog behaviourism meets progressive parenting. You may think there is no crossover, but there is a crossover. There's a hearty crossover, and Jo and I like to discuss this once a month together. So today, Jo and I will be discussing the role of discipline and compliance, or otherwise known as taking orders, when it comes to raising your children and raising your dogs. So first of all, Jo, thank you so much for joining me again on today's podcast. And do tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, and then what you think is the role of compliance and discipline when it comes to dog training.
Yeah, hi. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Jo, and I am a dog behaviourist who runs Paw Education, Dog Training and Behaviour. And I also have two young boys who are now 2 and 4. So when it comes to discipline and all of that within dog behaviour, oh gosh, it can be so controversial, as I'm sure you will all agree with me. First of all, I think it's one of these things where a lot of people would have heard about this alpha theory, where you have to be in control or the boss of your dog. I know it has been very big on TV over the years, that's very much a method that falls in line with a lot of people. It's very archaic, however, because it does ultimately just mean that you are in pretty much an autocratic society. So you say, everybody else does around you. And it's been disproved time and time again now that it is more based on relationship. It is more based on working as a team and a family unit. And yeah, you can already start to see the crossovers of how we interact with one another as human beings, that you still have this, you need to be in charge, even if you're a parent or a boss or whatever it is your role is in job, life, whatever it may be. But it is still very prevalent in a lot of the crossover stuff. So like we say, you'll have parenting ideals where absolutely not, how dare you have an opinion? This is my house, my rules, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to make all the decisions. And very much the same in dog world as well. But you can get the extremes of, right, that dog is, again, we talked about on another episode about suppressing a load of behaviours. We will just make those decisions for you, and hopefully with the idea being that because I rule, you will do. Doesn't work.
And is the theory, I'm guessing, behind disciplining dogs is that you ultimately want them to do what you tell them. So because they're obviously a dog and they're on a lead or off a lead, and you want to, if there's something happening, you want to be able to stop them running up to it. You don't want them to attack people. There's a certain sort of element of safety built in there. But do you think that there are other ways that you can achieve that same kind of behavior choices without discipline?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always going to be an element of, I say discipline. I don't like the word discipline, but I can't think of anything. It's almost like a correction, but again, that could also be perceived in many different ways, certainly in dog world. So I suppose, yeah, for clarity, in dog world, a correction or discipline, it could be anything as extreme as your e-collars, your prong collars, your slip leads, your anything that is quite physically aversive to the dog. It could be at one end of the scale where it's something that you don't really want to be doing from a discipline point of view. Taking it right down to a correction marker or an interruption noise, depends how you phrase it, but essentially it's the same thing. And that's ultimately where you just be going, like, no, don't do that. Like, all these little, just slight little noises would interrupt the behaviour from going on.
Is there a role for that, do you think, in dog training?
Again, grey area. It depends. I think we all naturally have those as in us. I think it would be fair to say the majority of us, if we had a dog store and we saw them doing something that we deemed inappropriate or we just didn't like it, we'd be like, no, stop it. And I suppose it's the equivalent of the human version of just saying no to somebody. And again, you very much do this with young children. I hear a lot of people interact with my children in a no, 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 stop it, wait, no. But I also hear a lot of people do it with dogs as well. Like if I walk into somebody's home for the first time and they're like, see, the dog just doesn't understand. No, look, watch. No, stop it. Get off, get down. No, all of these weird little things come out. I'm like, okay. So I personally like to rephrase it both from a parenting point of view and from a dog training point of view. Instead of focusing on the behaviors that I don't want to happen, including safety, what do I want to happen instead? Because when I can start to reinforce behaviors in a much better way, so arguably positive reinforcement, when I can start to reinforce behaviors that are going to occur more naturally then because they've got better value, then I don't necessarily have to interrupt behaviors as much. But I do still think that there is sometimes an element of discipline, correction, whatever you want to call it.
I'm guessing there are parents listening who may be saying, well, if I wait for my child to do something that I deem correct and I'm going to reward the good behavior rather than correcting the bad behavior, I might be waiting a really long time in order for that to happen.
Yeah. And it's this is where, again, arguably I've definitely walked into parenting in a better position than most because of coming from the dog background, and I've still got babies, so I'm literally molding them from puppy. However, I also work with a lot of people that don't come to me with puppies. They come to me with adolescent dogs and adult dogs, so there's lots of habits already ingrained, and there's all of this as well. But this is where ultimately it is thinking about changing the environment or setting up a situation so that you can get those aha moments and help that child / dog make a better choice, because we're not putting them in a situation to fail. An example, I suppose, would be certainly in dog world. I was working with a client this morning and we wanted to see what the dog would be like with the presence of another dog around. So we put safety measurements in place. And we had a closed door between the two dogs, but it was a glass door, so one dog was outside. And that dog came in slowly and we were offering food. The dog did not want food because the arousal had kicked in, and she was like, no, absolutely not. I cannot cope with this. So we was like, okay, this is going to be too difficult for you. So we just moved away and we added more distance. But that's us trying to set up a situation in the best way possible to go, back here, you're capable of showing a much better behavior instead of teeth, snarling, growling, lunging, barking, all of the undesirable stuff. But if I just give you some distance and put some management in place, then I can start to say that behavior is much better than all of this. And we start to do some classical conditioning, which is essentially just a bit of pairing. So, oh, look, scary thing equals good thing. And you start to work through it. And you can do it very similarly with children again. So it's thinking about, I know I've talked about before about the prep work I did for the airplane, but I didn't want to be that person with two young kids that were just completely freaking out and being incredibly overstimulated on the plane. So I started going, well, if that's the goal, I had to think, what do I want? I would like my children to sit quietly. Again, I'm not bothered if they are sat on their bums, but if they are quiet and they are able to express themselves where they can, or if I've given them enough to do, those are the things that I want. So these are the things I'm going to implement to start putting it in.
So you created an environment in which they were able to practice the skills that you wanted to mold. And I think there's no doubt that when it comes to dogs, I know that there's very much push to allow them to practice good behaviors and limit their opportunity to practice bad behaviors. Now, with a dog, it's clearer what is a good behavior and what is a bad behavior. Bad behavior might be barking, or not necessarily, of course, but or it might be snapping, it might be lunging, it might be those kind of things. Now, they might be what we generally would conceive of as bad behaviors in inverted commas when it comes to dogs. Now, with children, isn't it so much harder to decide what is a good behavior and what is a bad behavior? Because isn't it necessarily you deciding you said yourself about molding them and molding, you said you got them from puppies so you're able to mold them, and that really resonates with me because obviously I home educated right from the start, and I feel very much like I kind of created the family that I wanted. But I know that there are many people listening that would say, well, is it our job to mold our children? Is it our job to decide what is a good behavior and what is a bad behavior?
Yeah, and I think it's a very good observation, because actually, arguably, you can do the exact same with dogs as well. So we assume it's easier to identify what a bad behavior is because it's lunging, barking, growling, whatever it may be. However, I had a situation the other week where I saw some video footage of a dog in a daycare centre, and this particular dog had loads of dogs around him. And I could clearly see from the outset that this dog wasn't overly comfortable being in that environment. However, he was in it nonetheless. And he started, after a while, to just lift his lips a little bit and start to show a little bit of teeth. You then heard a human being getting involved and going, no, we don't do that. And to me, I was going, oh, goodness me, why are we punishing? Because that's essentially what we are. We're punishing that dog now for quite very clearly, in a nice way, believe it or not, saying to another dog, back off and give me some space.
And doesn't this link in very nicely with our last podcast about suppressing behaviours? Because one assumes that if you suppress these more natural, minimal behaviour responses, ultimately the dog will be like, okay, in that case, I'm going for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I suppose in a similar example then, so if I've got my two boys who again are 2 and 4, feels weird saying he's 4 now, he was only 4 last week. But if they are having a little bit of a to-do and, they're fighting over a toy, if I suppress either of them getting angry at the other, well, then it's still going to spill over somewhere else. And it's still, ultimately, do I then want a child as they grow up that then goes, I'm not allowed to show my emotion? So I will go, right, okay, Clay, Hudson, it's absolutely fine for you to get angry. We can't bite or hit the other person. But if you need to get that out of you, here, let's go and get a pillow and go and hit that instead. So I'm not suppressing it. I'm redirecting it into a more appropriate manner. And then as they grow, we still talk about, let's use your words where we can. I know that's really hard because you get that feeling inside and it's just got to come out. We read books about feelings, but we try and talk about emotional regulation as much as possible. And we try and model it ourselves, which is always the hardest thing, isn't it? But we work on that constantly. But it's giving them an outlet. So if when I see either of the kids suddenly open their mouth and walk toward the other as if they are going to bite the other, similarly with a dog, if I saw a dog doing the same thing, if I just went on both of those occasions, I am suppressing that behavior. So that individual then, whether it be the child or the dog, will go, oh, well, every time I offer this behavior, I just get told off for it. So guess what? I'm going to stop offering that behavior. This is in dog terms where I genuinely see dangerous dogs being a problem, because they learn very quickly that, okay, fine, I'm going to skip all of these steps that tell you to back off, I'm not comfortable. So therefore, I'm just going to do the thing that works. And unfortunately, that is where we end up with these more extreme cases of, fine, okay then. And obviously it depends on personality type and loads of other variables. But in a simplistic view, if we suppress behaviours enough, the individual will learn, okay, fine, I'll just stop offering it. And it makes sense.
Isn't there a point, for example, with the two children walking towards each other with their mouths open to bite each other, which I appreciate is a kind of amalgam of dogs and children there. But isn't there a point at which
my house? It's like a threat behaviour. It's like, go on then, you try and take this toy, mouth opens. I'm like, oh God, okay, at least it's a woman. I'll take it.
This is the reality of having 2 young boys, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So isn't there a point at which you would intervene and go, stop it, and then redirect the behaviour? So it's a minimal instant suppression in order to redirect.
Yes, and I think this is where you get the key difference between the the child and the dog. Speaking of which, one of mine has just come to join me, curled up next to me.
I know, I'm a bit sad that we don't have the video for everyone to see, because that's a very beautiful dog behind you.
She is, yeah, and she knows it. So I think this is where we have the key differences between dog and human, because ultimately humans, albeit mine are still young and developmentally are very different to an adult human being, they are still nonetheless a human being. So we talk the same language. I can't speak the same language to an animal. They don't speak human. So in that case, so if I was dealing with the dog that is now grinning and baring their teeth to say, back off, I would actually go, okay, yes, I'm going to back off. So if that was directed at me, I would back off and go, I would rather you learn that behavior gets me to move away, rather than, if we take it back to the start of this podcast, with the alpha theory of you need to be in charge and you need to be managing that situation. I could put pressure on that dog and be like, how dare you show your teeth at me? I am not, no, this is completely unacceptable. And again, depending on the personality, that dog can either come escalate their behavior and be like, well, no, I'm telling you to back off. Clearly, a nice little grimace of the teeth is not working, so I'm now going to escalate it and put in a lunge and a snap. And if that doesn't work, I'm just going up. Or I then get a dog that goes, okay, I'm really sorry, and they back off. But that's because that's their personality to go, I'm going to act offensive in the hope that it works, but actually I'm quite scared, so I'm going to back off.
I think a lot of this is based on responsiveness, isn't it? So, for example, if you've got children, and I know when my children were about the same age as yours, actually, I broke my leg and I was in a wheelchair for about a month because it was quite a bad break. And I wasn't able to intervene and respond as quickly as I would normally to diffuse things. And I realized in that month how automatic and how instinctive my interventions were. Not saying no or any of those things, but just kind of like intervening, saying something, like, distracting them, or putting their attention on other things, putting their attention on me, physically sometimes just kind of going in and giving one a bit of a hug because I sensed that there was stuff going on. And a lot of it is about being able to respond very quickly to your child. Now, I know, because I had two very close in age, that it's very difficult to be very ultra responsive when you've got a lot going on. And at that point, I just wasn't able to, because I wasn't physically able to be very responsive. So what advice would you give to parents who they don't want, they don't want a child who's like super discipline led or very compliant, but they do also want a child who behaves in such a way that the house is able to keep running, but they're maybe not able to just have this constant responsiveness to their behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where management plays a big part as well. And I appreciate there's bound to be people out there that have got more kids than me. But again, management, and I say the same with dogs, which is why I'm always comparing the two. But if I can tell that my boys are in a heightened state of arousal for whatever reason, whether it's tiredness, overexcitement, whatever it may be, I'll go, and I actually need to be doing stuff because I'm busy. I have two businesses. I'm doing a uni degree. We've got a renovation. I've got the dogs. We've got chickens. There's a lot going on. So I can't always be there. But if I can sense those moments, I either have to make the adult decision and go, right, realistically, whatever else I'm doing needs to just stop, and I need to help them regulate, even if that's just sitting with them for 10 minutes. And in our house, sometimes it's the case of just putting the virtual babysitter on at the TV and going, let's just sit down, let's just be quiet for 10 minutes. Sometimes it's a book, sometimes it's something else. And then once they're a bit more regulated, I can start to eke out of the room and continue what I'm doing. Or sometimes it's going, right, this isn't going to happen at all. One of you either needs to sleep, or actually I'm just going to separate you for a bit, and we have a stair gate. Admittedly, the older one can open the stair gate now, but he kind of knows it as a bit of a cue. It puts a delay in, let's say, because then the youngest can't open it. And it's management again. It's going, right, I just need to separate you. I either need to be in there, or again, if I can't physically do it, have I got anybody to call on? I personally don't have that joy as much as some people do. But it's always trying to manage it and then going, okay, so I'll utilize some days where I know I need to get loads of stuff done, and they'll be in forest school for a day. So I'm always trying to forward plan, time management, everything to help the kids regulate as best as possible with as much attention from me as possible. But then practicing those, kind of putting a little nod into dog behavior again, practicing those little separation moments so that they're okay being on their own.
Yeah, and I think if I was going to give sort of any sort of one tip to parents that want to have a household that runs smoothly but doesn't necessarily want to have this kind of discipline kind of role, or these kind of power plays that you get sometimes in families, I would say that it's about planning. You need to plan ahead, and especially when your children are young. And I will say to anyone who thinks, oh my God, there's like so much work, it is a lot of work to begin with, but it tails off, and then you'll get to the point when your children are older, sort of 10 or 11, and people will repeatedly compliment you on your children or say, aren't you lucky that X or Y? And I always say, it's not luck, it's a lot of hard work I've put in to get to this stage. And it's exactly the same with dogs, isn't it? Exactly the same. You put your time and effort in, and then you get a dog that runs nicely with the house, and you have that kind of smooth running. And so I would say, for me, when my children were younger, I would plan ahead for, and exactly the same with my puppy, I plan ahead for what I call interim moments. So movements from one activity to another, whether that's coming in the house after you've been out for the day, whether it's going out to go on a trip, when everyone's getting their shoes and socks on. It's exactly the same with my puppy. If I'm going to take her on a walk, it's that period just before I take her out the house, and then just after she comes back in and she's all kind of crazy and hyper. And for me, planning for those, what I call interim moments, was really helpful. So quite often, if we'd had a big stimulating day out, I had something called a separate room policy, which wasn't a punishment. It was just, okay, everyone's going to go into their separate rooms. Each child went into their bedroom, or they shared a room, so they just go onto their separate beds. And I would go into a room on my own, and it was very nice because I'm quite introverted, so I needed that sort of downtime. And exactly the same when it came to preparing to leave the house. I would plan meticulously for these kind of interim moments, these kind of moments from one activity to another. And actually, I learned that from teaching. When I was a trainee teacher, they said that's the point, that everything always kicks off in the classroom when you're going from one activity to another. When they're first coming in, first going out, or you're moving from, they're writing something down, they have to get their books out. That's always when something kicks off. And I actually learned that from teaching, how important it is to manage those moments. So I think that would probably be my one tip, I suppose, for if you want a smooth running house without having to be super disciplined and always like, no, don't do this. No, stop that. Because I hated that. I hated it. I think children just zone out. If they hear the word no too many times, they just zone it out. And then you're really stuck if you do need to say no, because they can't hear it anymore. It's like dogs. If you overuse their name and then ultimately you say their name, they don't come back when they hear their name, because they've just heard it so many million times they don't listen to it anymore. So what would be your one tip, Jo, for people that want that kind of smooth running house but without that harsh discipline, or in actual fact without discipline?
I think for me, and I appreciate this is really, really difficult because it's work on yourself, which is, and I think it kind of aligns with the last podcast we did. Manage your own expectations. Set yourself up to succeed. Set your child up to succeed. Set your dog up to succeed as much as possible. You've heard me mention that it was Clay's 4th birthday recently, and we had 17 children here and all of their adults. And we did it quite a late birthday party. We had one of these double-decker soft play buses, which just has carnage written all over it. However, because it was managed so well, I actually gave out instructions to all the adults who were bringing the children over and said, because it's a bit late in the day, I think the bus was getting here about 4 p.m. I was like, can you just try and manage, if they still need a nap because they're young, whatever, get one in the middle of the day. And we purposefully drove the boys, well, I got Darren to do it. He purposely drove the boys around for 2 hours around 11:30, 12 o'clock to make sure that they had a sleep. And then the day went beautifully. It was just really well managed. But our expectations were so aligned with going, we've got lots of young children here. We'd even set the dogs up to succeed. So we booked them in at their overnight kennels, because I was like, it's too much stress for them to be here. It's too much for me to expect them to cope in that situation. which they would have done, but it would have caused me more stress as well, with doors open. And if somebody who's not used to dogs leaves the door open and then suddenly I've got 2 huskies flying down the street, all of this, it's like there's only so much management I can do with that. So expectation is they're not going to cope. We're not going to cope. They get to go to somewhere where they're used to going and they have a good time. The kids are rested and they've slept. We've set them up. So we've been talking to them about this party for a week. They didn't even know the bus was coming, but they knew lots of people were coming over. And expectations, time and time again, it just meant that everybody could breathe and go, yeah, if you've got 17 kids running around your house, it's fine. I expect the house to get messy. I expect doors to be open. I expect food to be dropped and drinks to be spilt. It's fine.
Yeah. And I think this kind of prepping, and like I say, planning, and you're talking about managing your expectations, but also prepping everyone's expectations. It sounds like a lot of work, but I would honestly say that it's in the long run, it's much less work than firefighting, when you're constantly having to deal with stress and high emotions, and not high emotions are fine, but lots of negative, challenging emotions that your child then finds difficult to manage, because then you have to help them manage it. Then you're managing your own emotions, and that's much harder, I think, in lots of ways. Okay, so I think that's been a really fascinating discussion on discipline. And I think one thing that is lovely is that I think for anyone listening who thought, okay, we're going to have a conversation about discipline and children and discipline and dogs, there's been so little talk about actual discipline, because I think neither you nor I buy into that idea at all. And so I think that's one thing that is actually really lovely, is that anyone sort of listening in thinking we're going to be like, okay, so for discipline you need to do this and this, yeah, that's not ever how that was going to pan out in a home ed podcast, was it? But one thing you mentioned was about the alpha role when it comes to dogs. And I know that was a really popular thing sort of 10, 15 years ago. And actually, I was thinking for our next podcast, Jo, we could perhaps talk about family dynamics and family roles and power plays within family, and how that works within dog training, and how that works within bringing up your home educated child as well. That might be quite a nice one to do next.
I love it. I love these controversial topics you throw at me. I love it.
Well, thank you so much, Jo. You're always really good fun to chat to on our podcast, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about our alpha male or alpha roles in our next podcast. Thank you so much, Jo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.